The American Civil War. A Southern Fling and Northern Grit. 1861 to 1865. Once upon a time, in the land of the free, and a little bit divided, there was a heated argument about slavery. The story begins with the Southern states deciding they were totally done with the whole United States thing. They packed their bags, put on their best secession hats, and said, "We're outta here." The states that decided to form their very own club, the Confederacy, were South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina. Yep, a nice long list. Proof that sometimes when you don't get your way, you just walk out the door. But why all the drama? Well, for decades, the North and South had been intense about one little thing: slavery. The North, busy modernizing with factories, railroads, telegraphs, and banks, was all about the future. Meanwhile, the South, still relying on huge plantations and slavery for crops like cotton, was like, "We'll stick with what works, thanks." They made lots of money off cotton, and their slaves, who were considered property, were like the stock market of the day, just without the stockbroker's fancy suit. Now, imagine the South's confusion when, in 1860, Northerners started yelling, "We need to abolish slavery." The South's response? No thanks. They were doing really well financially, and by 1860, Southerners were raking in so much dough that they were twice as rich as the Northerners. But, of course, these things never stay simple. Enter the issue of expanding slavery to new territories, a real mess that had been brewing since the late 1700s. Every time new land was discovered, the North and South would argue over whether slavery should move with it. Spoiler: it was never an easy decision. Then came Abraham Lincoln, the tall guy with the beard, who didn't exactly make friends in the South. Running on an anti-slavery platform, Lincoln won the election in 1860, and that was basically the final straw. 7 states dropped out faster than someone leaving a bad party. The South seceded and started a brand new club called the Confederate States of America. Fast forward to the early hours of April 12, 1861. In a very dramatic fashion, Southern rebels decided to open fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston, South Carolina. Oddly enough, though, this dramatic showdown didn't result in any casualties. Instead, the Northern Major Robert Anderson and his 85 soldiers just gave up after being bombarded for 34 hours by the 5,500-strong Confederate Army. Talk about a slow-motion start to a war. And just like that, the Civil War was officially underway. Within weeks, more states followed the South's lead and hopped on the Confederacy bandwagon. The stage was set for what would become the bloodiest and most complicated conflict in U.S. history. The military showdown. North versus South. Let's get ready to rumble. With war officially underway, President Abraham Lincoln wasn't sitting around waiting for things to sort themselves out. He called for 75,000 militiamen to join the fight, for 3 months, because who doesn't like a good 3-month commitment? Meanwhile, he threw in a naval blockade of the rebellious southern states but insisted that, legally speaking, they were still just states in rebellion, not a full-blown country. To fund this party, he told the Treasury Secretary, "Hey, how about we give $2 million to raise some troops?" And just for fun, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus across the East Coast, eventually extending it nationwide. Because, why not mix a little legal drama in with the military chaos? On the Confederate side, President Jefferson Davis was no slouch either. The South called up 100,000 soldiers, upped it to 400,000, because bigger is always better, right? And geared up for a long fight. The Confederacy was going all in, ready to show the Union that the Southern way of life was not going down without a serious scrap. A battle of the numbers, North versus South. At first glance, it seemed like the Union, the 23 states that didn't bail out, had the upper hand. The North had a population of about 21 million. That's a lot of people, compared to the South's 9 million, with about half of them being slaves. If you're thinking, North for the win, right now, hold your horses. Sure, the North had over 100,000 manufacturing plants compared to a mere 18,000 in the South. The North also controlled more than 70% of the railroads. And just for some extra flair, the Union had a 30-to-1 advantage in arms production, a 2-to-1 manpower advantage, and oodles of commercial and financial resources. Plus, the Union had a functioning government, which, you know, is a bit handy when you're trying to run a country. Oh, and they had a regular army and navy, too. But wait, the South wasn't going to be the pushover people assumed. The Confederacy had some advantages, too. For one, they were fighting on home turf. They had the comfort of knowing where they were, while the Union soldiers had to deal with the whole traveling south thing. The South had a whopping 3,500 miles of coastline, which made that naval blockade look like a really bad idea for the Union. And let's not forget their military tradition. The South had really good soldiers, the kind that could put up a fight. Plus, the Southern soldiers weren't just fighting for their homes, they were fighting for independence. They believed they were defending a unique Southern way of life, which, spoiler alert, involved the whole slavery thing. The cause was dear to their hearts, and they weren't about to back down easily. The South wasn't necessarily doomed. After all, the U.S. itself had managed to fight and win against greatly superior forces in the Revolutionary War. If those scrappy colonists could do it, maybe the Confederacy had a shot. The commanders-in-chief. Who's got the better plan? At the start of the Civil War, both sides had plenty of issues in the command department. On the Confederate side, President Jefferson Davis looked like the smarter pick. With a resume that screamed military genius, Davis was a West Point graduate, a hero in the Mexican-American War, and a former Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce. He'd also been a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, so he had plenty of political chops too. Meanwhile, Lincoln was still trying to convince people he wasn't just a guy with a top hat and a knack for storytelling. Sure, he'd served in the Illinois state legislature and been a barely remembered congressman, but his claim to fame as a soldier? A brief stint in the Black Hawk War, where he didn't actually fight. But as history unfolded, Davis's polished resume didn't quite translate into effective leadership. Yes, he had some stellar qualities, dignity, firmness, and a willingness to stare down a crisis. But he also had some issues. Davis's pride could rival that of any peacock, and his sensitivity to criticism? Well, let's just say it was on a whole new level. He didn't hesitate to argue with generals or cabinet members at the drop of a hat, which, as you can imagine, didn't exactly inspire confidence. And let's not forget about the whole micromanaging thing. Davis was basically the type of boss who would email you at 2 a.m. with 10 more things to do, on top of the 20 he'd already given you. Davis was also battling constant health issues and was politically hampered by the South's system. With only a single 6-year term. Talk about a lame duck president before the duck even got in the pond. Davis didn't have much room to work with. His struggle to build loyalty and navigate a political system that was skeptical of parties and compromise made his job even harder. He tried to play all the roles: Secretary of War, General-in-Chief, and, let's face it, maybe even a little bit of junior barista. But his leadership had some major cracks. Enter President Abraham Lincoln, who had a lot to prove. As it turned out, though, Lincoln wasn't the inexperienced underdog he first appeared to be. Over time, he became a political rock star. In 1864, he was practically a Jedi master of leadership, smart, funny, humble, and laser-focused on winning the war. But, at the start, Lincoln wasn't quite sure what he was doing with the military. He tried, and failed, to pick the right generals. His first Secretary of War, Simon Cameron, was not exactly a military mastermind. So, Lincoln took matters into his own hands, helping plan battles, even though he was not a military expert. He soon realized, however, that having someone like Edwin Stanton, who was just as clueless about military strategy, was probably not the best idea either. Lincoln's first general-in-chief, Winfield Scott, was a War of 1812 hero, but by the time Lincoln took office, he was 75 and physically frail. Scott had to bow out, and young George B. McClellan stepped in. McClellan was a fantastic organizer, but his major flaw was that he overestimated the enemy and hesitated to attack. He even got to the point where he was publicly disdainful of Lincoln. Not exactly the kind of loyalty you want in your generals. Lincoln finally had to show McClellan the door in 1862, after yet another delay in the battle plans. Enter Henry W. Halleck, who was a good administrator but not exactly a military strategist. But by 1864, Lincoln finally found his general genius in Ulysses S. Grant, who was a master of the battlefield and knew how to get things done. Meanwhile, on both sides, the war wasn't just about generals. As the war dragged on, both Lincoln and Davis turned to local leaders and political generals, people with great political connections but not necessarily military experience. These appointments were often a disaster on the battlefield, but hey, at least they helped win a few votes. As battle casualties mounted and volunteer numbers shrank, both the North and South turned to conscription. That's right. It's time to draft some soldiers. And suddenly, everyone realized that maybe war wasn't quite as glamorous as it seemed at first. Strategic plans. The battle of wits and mistakes. When it came to grand strategy, President Jefferson Davis was the king of playing defense. His game plan was simple. Defend the Confederacy, occasionally throw in a cheeky raid into Union territory, and hope that somehow the North would just give up and go home. If the Confederates had been a little more aggressive in the beginning, they might have had a shot at taking some Northern territory before the North could find its generals and start flexing its big military muscles. But, instead, Davis chose to hold what he had. After all, defense is the best offense, right? Or so the saying goes, unless, of course, you're in a war and trying to defeat an enemy with vastly more resources. On the other side, President Abraham Lincoln was all about that Anaconda plan, and no, it's not a new summer blockbuster. The plan was simple. Blockade the southern coastline, cut off the Mississippi River, and slowly choke the life out of the Confederacy. Lincoln was basically hoping the South would tap out after some good old-fashioned economic strangling. It would take years of brutal warfare and endless casualties, but in the end, the Union was planning on coming out on top. Spoiler alert. It worked, but not before a lot of chaos. The war in 1861. Welcome to the battlefield, boys. The first action came in northwestern Virginia, where some non-slave-holding Virginians were having second thoughts about the whole secession thing. Meanwhile, Union General George McClellan, who seemed to have a special talent for organizing but not much else, led his 20,000 troops into the area and, after some hesitation and a lot of small victories, eventually cleared out the Confederates. He was feeling pretty proud of himself, and so was the Union. Heck, his victories led to the formation of West Virginia as a new Union state in 1863. Back in Washington, though, things were heating up. The Union Army was scrambling to get their ducks in a row, while the Confederates were doing the same in Richmond, their capital. When Confederate General Robert E. Lee ordered P.G.T. Beauregard to head to Manassas Junction to stop any Union moves, the stage was set for the first big showdown. Now, McDowell, under pressure from the public and Lincoln, was hastily sent off to Manassas to knock some Confederate heads. But, here's the kicker. McDowell's army wasn't really trained for the job, and neither was the Confederate force, making it anyone's game. The Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, depending on where you're standing, went down on July 21, 1861. The Union started strong, but Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who, by the way, got his nickname after standing like, well, a stone wall, rallied his troops and turned the tide. The Union forces, all hyped up and maybe a bit cocky, ended up running away in what can only be described as a total disaster. The loss was so bad that the Union thought they were facing an army of superhuman soldiers. The Confederates, on the other hand, thought they had it in the bag. Spoiler: neither side was right. The war in 1862, the year of twists, turns, and more confusion. By 1862, things started to heat up, and the East Coast saw the arrival of General Robert E. Lee, who took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee was no slouch. He wasn't just a Southern hero, he was a military genius. The Army of the Potomac, the Union's main army, found itself getting its butt handed to it, again and again. But while the Union was struggling in the East, things were looking better out West, where generals were taking a more aggressive approach. It was almost like the North couldn't get it together in one place without things going haywire in the other. And then, as if the Confederacy wasn't already facing enough problems, Lee's persistence in fighting back meant that Lincoln, in a surprise plot twist, got around to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which, if you didn't know, was a direct blow to the very institution the South was fighting to protect. Talk about salt in the wound. The war in 1863, a tale of Confederate glory and Union struggles. If you thought 1863 would be the year the Union finally turned it all around, think again. The first half of the year was like a bad sequel to a movie you'd rather forget. In the East, General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia were on a roll, racking up victories like they were collecting trophies. Meanwhile, Union forces in the West were getting stuck in the mud, most notably at Vicksburg, Mississippi, where the Confederates were stubbornly holding their ground. But then, in a plot twist straight out of a drama series, everything changed in July. The Confederacy suffered catastrophic losses, and Lee, who had been playing offense like a champ, suddenly couldn't even get a decent counterattack off. The Union secured control of the Mississippi River, effectively splitting the Confederacy in half. It was a game changer. For once, it seemed like the Union might have had a good run. Well, except for the fact that the war was taking a serious toll on everyone, and the people at home were feeling it. The Copperheads. A snake in the grass, or maybe just a lot of whining. Meanwhile, in the northern states, things were getting a little snaky. The Copperheads, a group of Democrats who were so disillusioned with the war they decided to call themselves after a poisonous snake, had a lot to say. They were angry about a few things. The suspension of habeas corpus, which felt like a slap in the face. The Emancipation Proclamation, which they saw as proof that the war wasn't just about saving the Union, but about ending slavery, and, surprise, the new draft laws that required men to fight in the war. Oh, and let's not forget their distaste for the income tax and the greenbacks, paper money, which, in their minds, were nothing but further signs that Lincoln was a power-hungry dictator. The Copperheads movement was like a potluck dinner where everyone brought their own grievances. The Irish and German immigrants who had been persecuted by nativists and Protestant reformers. They were all in. The folks from the lower Midwest with family ties to the South? Yep, they were down too. And of course, the conservative Democrats who loved their old-school Constitution. They jumped on the bandwagon as well. It was a motley crew of people who basically just wanted the Union to go back to being the Union they remembered, slavery and all. But here's the thing. The Copperheads weren't exactly in control of their own fate. Their influence was basically tied to how well the Union armies were performing. If the Union was losing, they gained traction. If the Union was winning, they didn't stand a chance. It was all about that battlefield success, baby. The war in 1864-65. The year of Grant's big move and the naval showdown. After a few years of it's fine military leadership from General Halleck, President Lincoln finally had enough. He was like, "All right, Grant, you're up." And just like that, Ulysses S. Grant, who had been racking up victories left and right, became the new general-in-chief of the Union Army. Halleck was out, and Grant was in, just in time for the big push to wrap things up. Grant wasted no time, arriving in Washington on March 8, 1864, with his own grand strategy. He left General Sherman to handle things in the West. He was doing fine. "Thank you very much," while Grant focused on the main event, taking down General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. To make sure the job got done, Grant moved his headquarters right into the heart of the Army of the Potomac, effectively taking charge. Meanwhile, Sherman had his own fun marching through Georgia to take on General Joseph E. Johnston in Atlanta. It was a tag-team effort that was bound to wear the Confederacy down. The Naval War. From tiny navy to mighty force. While Grant and Sherman were shaking things up on land, the U.S. Navy was also doing its part. Now, the Union's Navy might not have won the war, but it definitely helped ensure the Union won. Back in 1861, the U.S. Navy was more of a, "what's that?" kind of deal, with only 42 ships in commission and a bunch of them out of sight, off doing their thing overseas. But Lincoln was smart. He had a top-notch Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles, who quickly got to work transforming the Navy into a lean, mean, war machine. By the time Lee waved the white flag, Lincoln had 626 warships, 65 of which were ironclads. Because who doesn't love a ship that's practically indestructible? The Navy went from a mere 9,000 sailors in 1861 to a whopping 59,000 by the end of the war. They also ramped up spending, from $12 million to a cool $123 million. The Union Navy's blockade of the Confederate coastline, stretching over 3,500 miles, played a huge role in crushing the Confederacy's hopes, though it took a little while to get into full swing. The Confederacy's Navy, from zero to, not quite a hero, but close. On the Confederate side, things weren't looking so great for the Navy at first. The South didn't have much of a naval force to speak of, but that didn't stop them from trying. Enter Stephen Mallory, the Confederate Secretary of the Navy, who worked tirelessly to build up a naval force. He bought warships from Europe, refurbished captured Union ships, and got creative with Southern-owned vessels. The Confederate Navy had a bit of a "work with what you've got" vibe going on. Mallory's one big mistake was taking too long to realize the importance of controlling blockade runners, those sneaky ships that brought in much-needed supplies. But once he figured it out, the Confederacy stepped up its game. By the end of the war, they were running blockades like pros, and the Confederate Navy had made a respectable effort, even if it wasn't quite enough to change the course of the war. In short, 1864 to 65 was a year of significant shifts. Grant took the reins, the Union Navy became a real force to be reckoned with, and the Confederacy's naval efforts, though commendable, were ultimately unable to turn the tide. The stage was set for the final chapters of the war. The naval side of the Civil War was groundbreaking and full of firsts. Both the Union and the Confederacy embraced technological advancements, including steam power, the screw propeller, rifled ordnance, and, most notably, ironclad warships. On March 9, 1862, the first ever battle between ironclads took place between the Union's Monitor and the Confederacy's Virginia, formerly the Merrimac, changing naval warfare forever. But that wasn't all. The first warship to be sunk by a submarine occurred on February 17, 1864, when the Confederate sub Hunley sank the USS Housatonic. Meanwhile, Confederate sea raiders wreaked havoc on Union merchant ships. The Sumter, commanded by Raphael Semmes, captured 18 Northern merchant ships early in the war. The Florida, under John Maffitt, seized 37 federal prizes in 1863 alone. The Shenandoah, captained by James Waddell, took 38 Union ships, mostly in the Pacific. However, the most famous Confederate raider was the Alabama, also commanded by Semmes. Over 2 years, the Alabama captured 69 federal ships, but its reign of terror ended on June 19, 1864, when it was sunk off the coast of Cherbourg, France, by the Union's Kearsarge, captained by John Winslow. These daring raids sent marine insurance rates skyrocketing and seriously harmed the U.S. merchant marine, effects that lingered into the 20th century. Union naval forces, though, were no slouches themselves. Aside from their ironclad successes on inland rivers, they were crucial in coastal and amphibious operations. In November 1861, a Union flotilla led by Samuel Francis DuPont seized Port Royal, South Carolina, and in early 1862, other Union forces helped capture Roanoke Island and New Bern, North Carolina. In April 1862, the Federal Navy played a major role in reducing Fort Pulaski near Savannah, Georgia, thus closing the port to Confederate blockade runners. The Union's greatest coastal success came on April 25, 1862, when Admiral David Farragut took New Orleans, a major Confederate port, after running past the heavily fortified forts at the city's mouth. Despite some setbacks, like the failed attacks on Fort Sumter in Charleston in 1863 and 1864, the Union Navy made headway. Farragut's forces succeeded in reducing Mobile, Alabama's defenses on August 5, 1864, with the destruction of Fort Morgan and several Confederate ships, marking one of the toughest naval battles of the war. In late 1864, the Union finally took Wilmington, North Carolina, the Confederacy's last open Atlantic port, after a combined naval and army assault. By the war's end, the Union Navy had successfully blocked almost every Confederate port, with only Galveston remaining open. In conclusion, the Union Navy, affectionately dubbed Uncle Sam's Webfeet by Lincoln, played an essential role in the defeat of the Confederacy, ensuring that the blockade was effective, amphibious operations succeeded, and key ports fell into Union hands.